Conscious and intelligent robots will one day walk the earth. There's already groups of people working on making this happen. Some of them are working in the field of artificial intelligence, making machines that think. Some people are working in the field of machine consciousness and working on trying to make machines that are conscious. And maybe being intelligent and being conscious are two different things. There's also robots and people working on making robots that are even more lifelike than the ones we already have. Now, what can a philosopher do to speak to the question of whether this will happen? I mean, no one can know whether that will happen. For all we know, all life on the planet Earth is going to be wiped out by a giant asteroid, and that would include the people trying to make these robots and AI. So no one can guarantee that it will happen. But philosophers have weighed in on the question of whether there's something internal to the concepts of intelligence and consciousness, whereby we could just know by reason alone that it's never going to happen, that it's impossible for there to be conscious and intelligent robots doing anything, let alone walking the earth. Maybe there'll be robots and maybe they'll be walking, but it won't be intelligent or conscious, whatever it is. There's philosophical arguments that say that's just not going to happen. That's just not the sort of thing consciousness or intelligence is. And these arguments are, in some cases, hundreds of years old, and arguably some of this goes back for thousands of years. One of the reasons why it's important is it speaks to the question of what sort of thing are we? Are we machines? There's been a lot of success in the sciences based on treating the natural world as mechanical and operating according to mechanical principles. And there's a sense in which we've made huge gains in the sciences by understanding different parts of nature as a sort of a machine, that the sort of principles that govern a planet orbiting around the sun are pretty much the same ones that govern the swing of a pendulum in a old-fashioned clock. And perhaps life itself is a mechanical process. Quantum mechanics is the science of matter as we best understand it. And the mechanics of matter governs the way chemicals interact. According to one view, that's all there is to chemicals, are these mechanical physical processes, and biology is just made out of chemicals, and that's what you are. You are a conscious and intelligent machine. You just happen to be a meat machine. And the only difference between you and a robot that might come out of a factory is what you're made out of. But you essentially do the same things, and doing the same things, not just your outward behavior, but internally, the rough basic structure of what happens between input and output is the same. And that's what matters, at least according to a philosophical view known as functionalism. So this idea that conscious robots will one day walk the earth is very closely related to this philosophical view known as functionalism that says about minds, human minds, animal minds, that what makes something a mental state, like a belief or a desire or a feeling, is the kinds of causal relations that it enters into with your sensory inputs and your behavioral outputs, and the causal relationships it has with other mental states. And so one of the consequences of functionalism is this idea known as multiple realizability. One way of putting that is something is multiply realizable if there's lots of different physical ways of making it. So you can manufacture a wastebasket out of aluminum, or you can make it out of wood. You can have a waste paper basket that is made out of stone or concrete or plastic. There's all sorts of different chemical compositions that would give you a waste paper basket. All that matters for being a waste paper basket is that you have this rough general shape or structure that would allow you to keep waste paper off of the floor and make it easy to pick up and dump the whole thing out later. So it's what it does that defines it. And so what it's made out of doesn't really matter so much. It's multiply realizable. Contrast that with something like water. Water is H2O. In order to have water, you have to have 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. And at the molecular level, 2 hydrogen atoms are bonded with 1 oxygen atom, and that gives you a molecule of water. Water is H2O, and so isn't multiply realizable. Water isn't simply what water does. Water isn't simply these superficial characteristics like being liquid at certain temperatures and being transparent under certain conditions and being able to be poured and being able to dissolve certain things in. It has to have a certain kind of chemical makeup or it doesn't count as water. Similarly, diamonds have to be made out of carbon. You can have fake diamonds, rhinestones that maybe aren't made out of carbon. Instead, they look kind of like diamonds. They're clear and shiny, and diamonds are made out of carbon. Cubic zirconium is made out of some other chemical composition. So being a diamond is not multiply realizable. It has to have carbon arranged in a tetrahedral lattice to count as a diamond, and anything else is just a fake diamond. Now, there are synthetic diamonds. Synthetic diamonds are real diamonds. They're just made by people instead of forming in nature. And so one question about artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence, so-called, more like synthetic diamonds? Diamonds made in the lab are still diamonds. Or is it more like rhinestones? It's not really diamonds, it's fake. It has the outer appearance of diamonds, but you get down into it, not a diamond after all. So should we think of artificial intelligence as fake intelligence, at best just pretending to be intelligent, or is it just the real deal, but made by people, the way they make cars? It's synthetic intelligence, real nonetheless, even though it's lab grown or lab developed. So one sort of argument that speaks to all this is one that comes from the famous computer scientist, mathematician, and arguably philosopher, Alan Turing, who is credited with coming up with many of the ideas that were really important for the development of computers in the 20th century. And he addressed this question of machine intelligence. Could there be machines that are made by people but have real intelligence? And he proposed a kind of a test that we now call the Turing test. He called it this game, the imitation game. And before I say a little bit more about what the Turing test is and whether it's any good, let's go back to Turing. Turing is addressing this question of whether machines can be intelligent. And he says, in so many words, we need to come up with some kind of way of addressing that question that is fair or impartial. If you just say, like, no, because they're machines, they can't be intelligent, well, then you're not really even taking the question, can machines be intelligent, seriously. You're just saying, like, well, no, I mean, if they're machines, they're not intelligent, end of story. But if you want to give that question a fair shake, you need to come up with some kind of test that doesn't just prejudge and therefore be prejudicial. It doesn't just prejudge the question based on what we already know about machines and how they're different from us. We already know that they're made, they don't develop naturally. We already know that they're made out of substances different from us. Computers would be made out of wires and silicon chips and gallium arsenide, and we're made out of lipids and proteins and or all sorts of other organic chemicals. So set aside what we already know to be different between us and machines and try to come up with some sort of test that would give you some kind of fair shake on the question whether a machine can be intelligent. And he proposes something that we now call, as I mentioned before, the Turing test. and he called it the imitation game. Suppose there was a computer program that was running, and the output of the program was such that if you interacted with it, it might seem to you like you're having a conversation with a real human being. So imagine a computer program that is running on a computer that's in another room, and you are having a text-based conversation with this computer program, and you're trying to guess, maybe by typing in questions and seeing how it answers those questions, you're trying to guess whether it's actually this thing in the other room is a real human being or not. And suppose there's multiple conversations that you have at multiple times, and some of the conversations you're having just by text, typing and reading replies on a computer screen, there actually is a human being on the other side that is texting you and you're answering back. And the other conversations you're having is with an artificial intelligence program being run on a computer. Would you be able to tell the difference? If you can't tell the difference based on this text-based interaction, which one is the real human being and which one is an artificial intelligence that is simply attempting to imitate a human being, then the artificial intelligence in question has passed the Turing test for machine intelligence. Turing says, in so many words, that what else could there be to count as evidence for intelligence? If we're going to come up with a fair test that abstracts away from these prejudicial factors, like, well, whether was it born of a human male and female, what was it made out of protein and lipids, does it have human DNA, like that prejudges that. If you define intelligence that way, it prejudges whether a machine can be intelligent. So what you're left with is something like a rough sort of behavioral test. Can it behave in these sorts of ways that don't prejudge based on what it's made out of? And if so, if it could fool a human being, then it counts as intelligent. And as you might imagine, it's controversial whether the Turing test is a good test or not. And you can imagine all sorts of situations, perhaps, in which someone just was wrong in guessing whether this thing was a human being or not. And they might similarly be wrong in guessing whether it was intelligent or not. But how can you argue further one way or another about whether the Turing the Turing test is a good test? One very famous and much discussed argument against the validity of the Turing test is an argument that's known as the Chinese room argument, which originates with the philosopher John Searle. To understand Searle's Chinese room argument, you have to work through two thought experiments. And the first thought experiment, the one that gives the argument its name, is a thought experiment about what we're going to call the Chinese room. And it's best to think of that thought experiment as kind of a warm-up for the thought experiment that really is important for the main argument. But let's do this first thought experiment. So imagine, says John Searle, imagine that John Searle only speaks English, and he's never learned any other language, and he especially has never learned Chinese. But artificial intelligence researchers have developed let's imagine, a computer program that they claim is able to pass the Turing test for machine intelligence. And specifically, it's able to pass a Turing test for understanding Chinese. So the humans that would interact with this program while it's running would have a conversation with it, that they type in Chinese, and the computer is able to respond in Chinese, and it passes the Turing test insofar as any human that understands Chinese and has a chat with this program would be fooled into thinking this is a perfectly intelligent understander of Chinese language. So one way of thinking about a program is like a set of instructions, and the computer follows those instructions. But in theory, a human could follow those instructions, because the instructions are really, when it comes to computers, that are made along the lines that Turing himself recommended, and instantiate what is referred to as a Turing machine, you can think of what a computer does as following instructions for writing and reading symbols. It has a program that is basically telling it that when you encounter this symbol, then do this. And the next thing that it does is to write another symbol, or erase a symbol, or go to the next symbol and read it. And reading and writing and erasing can be defined independently of whether it understands what the symbol symbolizes. We're thinking of the symbols here just in terms of like their shape. So the letter A you might think of as having certain kind of meanings. By itself, it is the indefinite article, and you could use it in a sentence as a word. Like you might say, a dog is chasing me, and there the letter A has meaning. But what matters for talking about symbols insofar as computers are working with symbols is simply that they are responding to the symbol as one physical thing versus another physical thing. They don't intrinsically necessarily have any kind of understanding. So these instructions are just kind of like a part of a machine that make it interact with symbols in different ways, and it could make a new symbol and remove an old symbol, and that's what we mean by reading and writing. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about understanding. And just like the machine can follow the instructions, a human being can follow the instructions. So imagine this program that is, when it's run on a computer, seems to simulate a Chinese understander. Searle says, imagine I, John Searle, who only understands English, follow the program, which is written in English, and it tells me what to do with these various Chinese symbols. So this program is printed out in a book. John Searle sits in a room. This is the Chinese room. And people outside of the room put Chinese messages into the room through these slots. And John Searle, who's sitting inside of the room, receives these symbols. He doesn't understand what they mean. He looks in this book that has the program written out, and it's written in English, but it has pictures of the different Chinese symbols in it. Searle doesn't understand what these symbols mean, but he can look at them and then look at the pictures in the book and try to match them accordingly. And by following the English instructions in the book about what to do with these symbols that are just, for him, these pictures, these meaningless squiggles, he can know that if he gets this symbol and this symbol and this symbol, then follow this instruction, this instruction, this instruction, and send out the out slot these other symbols. And someone on the outside, they might have to wait a while, but leaving aside the issue of how long it takes, it would otherwise seem like they're interacting with a Chinese understander. They would get all the responses that someone who actually understood Chinese would get, because we've hypothesized that this program, when run on a computer, passes the Turing test for intelligence. And so, abstracting away from things that are prejudicial about the makeup of the thing that runs the program, it would follow then that Searle himself in the Chinese room can run the program. So what does this have to do with whether artificial intelligence and conscious intelligent machines, whether that's possible, whether it's possible at all that they will one day walk the earth? And we could put the argument like this. If functionalism is correct, if artificial intelligence is possible, then a computer program, if run would suffice for understanding Chinese. And if it didn't suffice for understanding Chinese, then that would disprove the very possibility of artificial intelligence, and it would disprove functionalism, it would seem. And Searle says, well, look what we have here with the Chinese room. I am running the program, but I don't understand Chinese. We've hypothesized that I only understand English. I'm following these instructions written in English. I'm taking these Chinese symbols that I don't know what they mean. I'm just taking them from the one slot, looking up, matching them, sending the different ones out the slot, and I still don't understand Chinese. For someone on the outside of the room, it might appear that there's someone who understands Chinese in the room, but I am running the program and I don't really understand Chinese. So it's possible that the computer that was running the program, it doesn't understand Chinese either. There's no reason then to believe that it would understand. And this would seem to disprove the thesis of artificial intelligence and similarly the thesis of functionalism. Now, Searle himself brings up a sort of obvious objection to this argument put in terms of the Chinese room. And it goes like this. Perhaps we should think of the Chinese room as having Searle as a mere part. And it's the whole room. We might call this the whole system that has Searle as a proper part, but also the book with the instructions and the symbols also. The system understands. So it's not John Searle that's running the program while failing to understand. John Searle is, yes, failing to understand, but he's not by himself running the program. The whole system is running the program. So this gets referred to as the system's reply to the Chinese room argument. But now here comes Searle with a response to that system's reply, and it's another thought experiment. I told you there was going to be two thought experiments, so this is the real thought experiment, the one that is designed to get around the system's reply. Searle says, forget about the room and the book, because I, John Searle, could, in theory, memorize everything that's in the book. I'm still just memorizing English. I'm memorizing also all the pictures of the Chinese symbols, and what I'm memorizing is what the shape of the symbol looks like. I don't know what they mean. And so in theory, hypothetically, you could show me Chinese symbols and I just think about, a symbol that looks like that. Well, then just by accessing my memory, I realize that means I should follow instruction 72 and 86, and then I output, these symbols. And so, leaving aside the fact of how long this might take, it's still possible for John Searle to run the program without understanding Chinese. And the system's reply now is powerless because he is the whole system. So you can't say the fact that Searle doesn't understand Chinese is meaningless because the whole system understands Chinese. Well, now we've gotten rid of this larger system and just made him the system. He's running the program and he doesn't understand Chinese. So therefore, it's not true that anything that runs the program thereby understands Chinese. So that's a big argument, big in terms of how much discussion it has generated. That's a big argument against this view that conscious, intelligent robots will one day walk the earth. Is there an argument for the opposite conclusion besides the one embodied in the Turing test? And one really interesting argument is argument that we could trace back to at least as far as the philosopher Gilbert Harman, but really became popularized in the 90s through the work of David Chalmers. And it's an argument we could refer to as the neural prosthesis argument. The idea of a prosthesis or prosthetic organ replacements would include things like artificial leg and artificial heart, where you've got a part of a organism that is replaced by a machine. Hypothetically, our best guess about how humans are able to think and be conscious is by virtue of their brains and what their brains do. And brains are made up of cells, and one of the most important cells that brains are made up of are neurons, cells that are called neurons. And a hypothetical neural prosthetic would be something that replaces a neuron. So imagine we have the capability of replacing neurons with microchips. We already have technological replacements for other bodily organs, like artificial hearts and prosthetic limbs, prosthetic hands. And some of these replacements, like for example, the artificial heart, are highly functional. Someone can live with their heart, natural heart, removed entirely and replaced with this machine that is able to pump blood through their body, and they live with it. And we already have implemented technologies in which there are brain implants, and there's been successful work replacing the hippocampus of rats with microchips that are able to function in many of the same ways that the hippocampus does, and enable the rat to learn information, create memories, and the information learned is stored in this artificial microchip hippocampus. So this kind of neural prosthetic technology is not pure science fiction. A lot of it is real. But what we're going to describe now is more of a thought experiment than something that's real. And that is, imagine someone slowly gets every neuron of their brain replaced by microchips. Each of these microchips we can think of as doing what each neuron is doing. And one rough way of thinking about what the neurons in your brain are doing is that each of them is connected to a whole bunch of other neurons. And information comes into your nervous system from the external environment. Light and sound and chemicals in the air and in your food are transduced at various sensor cells, which are themselves neurons, and they create electrochemical signals that are passed along to other neurons and eventually get into your central nervous system. Then one of the most interesting parts of the central nervous system is the brain, which is composed of many, many neurons, each of which are sending electrical chemical signals to the many other neurons that they're all connected to. And in theory, we could replace the functioning of a neuron with a microchip. The neuron might be made out of protein and lipid. The microchip isn't. It's made out of silicon and gallium arsenide, but nonetheless, each of them are able to bring in these electrical signals and then output other electrical signals. So we start the procedure by replacing just one of your neurons with a microchip. And by hypothesis, this microchip is able to map inputs onto outputs in all the same ways that the neuron that it replaced did. So if before the procedure you were able to learn information, you could learn like what the title of this book is by looking at it. After we replace that neuron with a microchip, you could still do that. You could look at the title of a book and then learn what the title of the book is. Information is coming into your eyes, starting as light, electromagnetic radiation, and then being transduced into electrochemical signals. And previously, some of those electrochemical signals were being routed through that neuron, which is now replaced and instead being routed through the microchip. So in David Chalmers' version of that argument, he says, imagine that more and more of your neurons are being replaced by microchips. And at each stage of this process of replacing more and more of your neurons with microchips, there's little tests that we could perform or observations we can make. We could observe you from the outside. The various other researchers that are involved in this can observe you from the outside, but you can also observe, quote unquote, yourself, as it were, from the inside. From the outside, it's quite clear that you will be the same with respect to everything, except for the fact that, you have one fewer neurons and one more microchip. All the information that comes in through your senses and gets processed, stored, and output will be the same, because by hypothesis, the microchip is doing all the things relative to the other neurons that the replaced neuron was. So there's not going to be any observable change in your behavior. You're going to answer questions in all the same ways. If you would get 70% right on some knowledge test, you would still get 70% right on the very same test. If you had previously memorized the phone number, for the house that you first lived in, you'll still have that information memorized after we replace that neuron with the microchip that does the same thing. And this will be true no matter how many neurons we replace. And not only will the outward observations be the same, but so will the inward ones. So one extra thought experiment that Chalmers adds on to his neural prosthesis thought experiment is he says, imagine The contrary is true. Imagine that there's some point at which, when we replace a neuron by a microchip, even though your outward behaviors are the same and you act and speak in all the same ways, that on the inside there's something different. Suppose that that when we switch to the chip, the way red things look to you it now becomes the way green things look to you, and vice versa. Is that conceivable? Imaginable? Now, from the outside, the people on the outside observing you, they wouldn't know, but you're in there. Wouldn't you know? Now, here's where things get really tricky. If you did know, you wouldn't be able to say. Because if you were able to say that there was a change, then that saying is a verbal behavior that the people on the outside would be able to observe. But we've already said there would be no observable behavior. So what we have to imagine now is that you would undergo this mental change after a certain number of neurons were replaced, but it would have no behavioral change. That you would notice a difference, but somehow not be able to say it. You would somehow be experiencing colors differently, but be unable to make your mouth move and say, hey, there's been a change in my experience. And Chalmers, I think, makes a convincing argument right here that it's really not conceivable that that would be the case. That if we made those changes in the microchips, then it wouldn't result in a change in what it's like to be you, what it's like for you to see colors. It wouldn't make any change in consciousness. Similarly, instead of imagining a possible switch in consciousness, a switch from seeing things as green versus seeing things as red, imagine your consciousness just went away. You just were like a zombie, all was dark inside. Well, it would make no difference on your outward behavior. And if there was some kind of switch where we could switch back and forth from a neuron to the chip, we could flip that switch over and over again. And every time the switch went one way, you would just have no consciousness at all, but you still act like it. And then we flip the switch the other way and your consciousness comes back. But all throughout, you would be unable to say like, oh, I lost consciousness there. You would seem the same throughout. And again, the conclusion urged is that that's just not conceivable. That if you undergo these microchip replacements of your neurons, you've effectively become a robot, and you know from the inside that you are a conscious robot, an intelligent robot. So we've got two arguments with opposing conclusions. The Searle argument that says, no matter how sophisticated a computer program running on a machine is, it will never really understand Chinese. It will never really be intelligent. It will really never have consciousness. And then there's this other argument, also based on thought experiments, saying that actually we can make such a machine. And one way to make it and guarantee that this machine will be a conscious, intelligent machine is to base it on you, someone who already knows of themselves that they are conscious and intelligent. We replace your brain tissue with silicon chips, and just like Darth Vader basically became a robot by having his organic parts replaced by cybernetic prostheses, you would become a robot too and know throughout that you have retained your consciousness. And this is why, barring some outer factor like asteroid destroying the whole Earth, intelligent and conscious robots will one day walk the Earth.